Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I never thought a reality television series, especially the one called 19 Kids and Counting, would introduce me to the world of sex offenders. But it did when I read Emily Horowitz's compelling op-ed piece in the New York Daily News defending the parents of one of those kids, Josh Duggar. Dr. Horowitz, the chairperson and associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at St. Francis College, is the author of the book, Protecting Our Kids, How Sex Offender Laws Are Failing Us. And she's my guest today.
Thank you for having me.
So, I'm delighted to have you. So, what compelled you about the defense of the Duggars? Because most of everything is, appalling, is general shock at how they responded to this.
Well, I was shocked that there was no debate when this incident first was uncovered.
And the incident is one of the 19 had what?
Had improperly, inappropriately touched his siblings when he himself was 14. And now he's in his late 20s, he's married and he has kids, and everybody, the pitchforks came out and everybody went crazy and said, this is a horror, this show should be off the air. How can this young man even be allowed around his own children? Why wasn't he in prison? Why didn't his parents go to the police? The parents handled it themselves. They kind of went to, they handled it within their family. They didn't go to the police in the right way. But having spent the last few years doing research on sex offender laws, I completely understand why they didn't go to the police and why they didn't go to therapists. Most therapists are mandated reporters, so they would have gone to the police one way or the other. And the problem is when you go to the police and you tell them that your child is inappropriately touching your other children, you will be chewed up and spit out by the cops.
Into the system that has almost no end, basically.
That's right.
How many people are there on sex offender lists?
There's over 800,000 people on the sex offender registry right now.
And there is federal legislation, and then each state has its own legislation.
That's right. So you can, there's the Megan's Law, which was passed in about 1996, and then the Adam Walsh Act, which was passed in 2006.
And those are federal.
Those are federal laws, but each state has to abide by those. So the Adam Walsh Act in 2006 mandated that children could even be on the sex offender registry. So many states, it differs by state. In New York, we don't have minors on the sex offender registry, but many states do. And in some states, children as young as 12 are on the sex offender registry, even younger in some cases.
And then when they're on the when you're on a sex offender registry, there's no gradation, is there?
There are levels, but the problem is let me give you some research and data, first of all. So about 1/3 of those who sexually abuse children are children themselves. So we don't differentiate in many cases if it's a child offender or an adult offender or the age difference between the victims and the perpetrators. So, for example, some of the people I interviewed for my book had committed crimes similar to Josh Duggar when they themselves were children. And their parents, in one case, the parents went to a church, they went to their pastor and they said, our son is inappropriately touching our daughter. He was 12 at the time. And the pastor called the police. They were a mandated reporter. This young man was then put in a jail for 3 years and then on the public registry for over 10 years. He's in his late 20s now and still dealing with the realities of being on the sex offender registry. He never again reoffended. Juveniles are very treatable. Rehabilitation works. In many cases, particularly with juvenile offenders, intervention works and treatment works. So the idea that in the case of Josh Duggar, if his parents had gone to the police or gone to a therapist who had then gone to the police, that he would have been jailed for years and then on a public registry, it's not really necessary. It's not effective. It makes us feel good, but it doesn't help.
And when they jail a child, it's into a youth facility, isn't it?
Right. It differs state by state, but in the case I was talking about,
supposedly therapeutic communities that aren't therapeutic.
Right. Some are sex offender treatment centers, some are juvenile jails, but they're locked facilities. They're not, therapeutic. You don't go home at night. You're there, and you're with all kinds of offenders, and it's
so 30% of the 800,000
Well, no. One third of people who sexually abuse children are minors, according to Bureau of Justice statistics. Right. We don't really know on the registry what percent are minors, or on the public registry, but we do know overall on the registry there's over 800,000 people.
So on the registry, it includes adults who have raped adults?
That's right. But what interests me is that all the rhetoric surrounding the registry is we want to protect children. These registries make us feel really good. They make us feel like we're doing something, we're protecting the children.
So it's because of the children that we started all these registries.
That's right.
That's the history of it.
That's right. That's right. So the registries came about because of a few high-profile stranger danger cases, but the facts about child sexual abuse are far different than the registries would lead us to believe. Most children are sexually abused by people like their siblings, people within the family or acquaintances, over 90%. Stranger danger is not a statistically significant problem. Very few children are abducted and sexually abused by strangers, yet all of our policy is focused on this. So if we really want to protect children, we have to kind of step back and get the emotion out of this and look at the facts and the research and the data. So most of the offenders that I interviewed, they did have child victims, but the majority were older male perpetrators. About 97% of people in the registry are male. Differs a little bit by state. In New York, that's about right. And most of the victims were young girls who were not children, but between 12 and 17, depending on the age of consent. So they were legally non-consensual, but they were nonviolent. They were really statutory cases. So those were most people that I interviewed. And most people I interviewed, they didn't resent that they had to go to jail or prison, that they were on parole. They understood they'd made a mistake. They understood they'd committed a crime. What is troubling is the registry and the permanent banishment and punishment. All the rhetoric about Josh Duggar said he should never, ever be around children again. His sisters were interviewed and they said, we forgave him. We dealt with it as a family. Why is the public coming in and saying he should never be around us again? That's not what they wanted. They obviously wanted him to get help and treatment, but they didn't want his life ruined.
But when they're on the registry, this is when it starts.
That's right. The registry is post-parole.
Post-parole. You get out, you're in prison, you serve your term, you're out. And some of the people in prison really weren't guilty also, right?
Right. Well, I'm on the board of the National Center for Reason and Justice, and we're an organization that looks at hysteria and panic surrounding crimes against children, and we focus on false allegations and wrongful convictions. And we know that all crimes involving children, there are false allegations, there are wrongful convictions, starting in the 80s with the daycare sex panic cases.
When we had all the satanic
ritual abuse, and the McMartin case.
If you remember taking all those people in front of the cameras, all the cases in court, yes.
Right. So that's where we've had like 30 years of nonstop sex panics surrounding this issue of children and sex.
So what happens when you get out of prison and you're on the list? What are the restrictions?
So, well, your picture's on a website. Anybody can look up. You can go on the New York State Sex Offender Registry. You can type in your address and you can see all the pictures of all the offenders that live in your neighborhood. In many states, you can see where people work. You can see the age of the victim, the nature of the crime, and you can see everything about them. And it's really scary. You see mugshots of people, right? So we have 800,000 pictures on the internet. There's apps you can put in your address and see the sex offenders who live in your neighborhood. Local news stations fan a lot of flames about this. So
sensational stories.
Right. So they'll say, like, before Halloween, like, check on your app, look at all the sex offenders in your neighborhood.
Everybody announces before Halloween.
Right.
Don't take candy that isn't wrapped. And you make a point in your book about homemade cookies. That this is the thing we used to strive for, this personal touch.
Right. Isn't
now
that
we're
nice?
Suspicious.
Right.
There's going to be a razor blade. Right.
But just like there's really never been instances of razor blades in apples, there's really never been instances of children being abducted by strangers and sexually abused on Halloween. It's probably one of the safest nights of the year because there's people out, children are out, people are actually like meeting their neighbors. But we've created this panic and hysteria and fear around Halloween and sex offenders. I talked to one sex offender who in his county where he lives in a southern state has to go spend Halloween night at the sheriff's office. Other sex offenders, I spoke to the wife of a sex offender, and they have 3 children. He was on the registry before they got married. They're married, they have 3 children. They have to keep all their lights out on Halloween, have no signs, no indication that they're home. And the sheriff does a check to make sure that all the sex offenders are home.
And in some of the states, they notify a community. If you move into a house, the neighbors are automatically notified.
That's right. Many states have community notification, and it differs by counties. So you get a postcard that says, a child sex offender is moving into your neighborhood, beware. So I talked to one woman whose husband, when he was 19, he'd had an affair with a 15-year-old.
A consensual affair.
He said, yes, he said it was consensual. He was convicted. He wound up taking a plea and was on the registry because it was consensual, but legally a 15-year-old can't consent.
Okay.
Right, but yeah, they
mean,
they were in love.
For people
right?
to understand, they were in love. It wasn't a forced.
That's right. And so he was 19 and she was 15, and now he's married. He's 30. His wife is 30. And when they moved in together, all the neighbors got a very scary postcard that said, this man is moving into the neighborhood. He's a child sex offender. And in that case, in a southern state, the family actually, the wife and husband actually received a bill for the cost of mailing the postcards because it was, they're offenders, they have to pay. There's a tremendous cost. Sex offenders, they have to register, they have to pay all kinds of fees. In many states, they have to pay for polygraph tests.
Yeah, I was going to say that. They're mandated to have polygraph tests.
That's right.
How often? Every year, 6 months?
It depends, right. It depends.
It truly is, there's no end.
There's no end. They're permanent, it's banishment, it's destructive. They're not helping. We're destroying people's lives with these laws, and we're not making anybody any safer. Since Megan's Law, since the Adam Walsh Act, we haven't seen steep drops in child sex offenses. Nobody's against punishment when people make mistakes or commit crimes, but I think the draconian nature of these punishments, we have to stop and think, why are we doing this? What do we want to get out of it? We're not helping anybody be any safer.
And in prison also, I mean, the sex offender is the lowest person in prison, subject to much abuse.
That's right. That's right. They always say you're better off in prison if you killed a child than if you sexually abused a child.
So how did we get? Is it this? It's a puritanical. How did we get this way?
I'm not sure exactly how we got this way. I know that journalists like Debbie Nathan, who wrote a book called Satan's Silence she wrote it with Michael Snedeker, and they're both on the National Center for Reason and Justice board with me. They argue that a lot of it came out of panic about women returning to work in the 70s and children being in daycare and mothers being out of the home and children being vulnerable to strangers or I guess daycare providers who are sexually abusing their children. And it was kind of anti-feminist.
And a lot of it is also supposedly about the conservative right.
That's right. That's right. Women should be home with their children and protecting their children.
Following that whole philosophy. But did we not have this attitude in, say, 1940?
Not really. There's a book called Moral Panic by Philip Jenkins, and he talks about how the child molester has kind of changed in our society. In the 60s, he was kind of like a mild-mannered loser who was Chester the molester, flashing kids in the park. Today, it's the peak of horror to be a child molester. It's the worst thing you can be. Many people say we should just kill child molesters. They're worse than murderers. They should have their own prison. Like a lot of people say, I'm all for reform for nonviolent drug offenders, but sex offenders, they're off the table. Forget it. Like they are untreatable, they're uncontrollable. But the reality is that sex offenders have very low recidivism rates. It's very humiliating to be arrested and prosecuted for a sex offense. Treatment works. But why do we have this idea that they're different than any other kind of offender?
And we have a general opinion that treatment doesn't work.
That's right. Treatment does work, and many of these offenses aren't the kind of instances, stranger danger instances that we're all afraid of. There are people who violently rape. There are people who sexually molest children, and nobody condones this behavior. None of the people who want reform of sex offender laws condone any of this behavior. They just want the punishment to fit the crime and be appropriate, and to have post-parole restrictions is really pretty extreme. No other country has them.
We don't have them for other crimes. You can murder somebody.
That's right.
And get out on parole.
That's
or
right.
Could have maxed out. You're out of prison. No neighbor is notified there's a murderer in the neighborhood. Right?
That's right. That's right. So these attitudes are very, very problematic and deep-rooted, but they're emotional and they're related to hysteria and panic. And I do think they make us feel better. We're protecting the children. And one of the chapters in my book is how we don't really talk about, there is a lot of child maltreatment and neglect, but it's highly correlated with poverty. And that's much more difficult.
You go back and do the history of child welfare. Let's do a little bit of that. Tell me.
Okay, so one of the chapters, the first chapter talks about the first child abuse legislation, and it kind of highlights how our attitudes towards punishment and crime have changed. There was a woman named Jolly Kay who testified before Congress in the early 70s about how she was a child abuser. She beat her kid, she almost killed her kid, but she got help. She cured herself and she was no longer a child abuser. And she mesmerized Congress and she helped get legislation passed. And people said, oh my gosh, you can help yourself, you can pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can stop being a child abuser. And she was kind of a hero. She was interviewed by Life, she was interviewed on a news program. And her story of redemption, we loved it as a society. And we thought, oh, child abusers can change. It was about physical child abuse. But today, it's very different. If you confess that you nearly killed your child on TV, it would say lock you up, throw away the key, and never, ever let you out. But I think we used to think that people could, change as a result of, I guess, as you would say, consciousness raising. People, you can become aware of your behavior and you can change. There's some restorative justice efforts that are being used now with child sexual abusers. I mean, and there's some interesting work being done on what we call non-offending pedophiles, people who have these impulses but don't want to act out on them. And these are very exciting and interesting, and I think in order to really address child sexual abuse, if we want to address it, we have to kind of think that people can change, people can be rehabilitated, and that punishment in very extreme forms is not helpful.
The pedophile is an expression also that's always thrown out.
Right.
And how does that is a sexual, what's the definition?
I'm not really an expert on pedophiles or child molesters. My book is really mostly about the effects of this registry and the effects of the panic and hysteria about child sexual abuse.
So there are but there are pedophiles.
There are people who are sexually attracted to children. There's people who act on it. And
so a pedophile is somebody who's sexually attracted to children.
Yes, it's not my. I've been
I'm
recently.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh about this
Okay.
because it causes so much confusion in the general public. If you're not really a student of all these differentiate, you don't know really what's understanding.
Right, and there's a lot of good work on it. It's not really my area of expertise, but what I'm really interested in is how these laws are destroying people's lives, and they're kind of unchecked because even talking about these laws opens one up to accusations that one is anti-victim, that one doesn't care about children, and that's really why we don't look at these laws, and that's why politicians fear saying, hey, you know what, like maybe we shouldn't have a public registry, or maybe we should only have a public registry for the worst of the worst. We treat everyone like they're the worst of the worst. There was a study done in Georgia that looked at everybody who was on the sex offender registry, and a very, very small percentage was actually at risk of reoffense, was a danger to the public. So there's all these people on the registry. Like there's somebody I interview in my book in Georgia who had an inappropriate chat online with somebody he thought was 14, and he tried to meet her for sex. It turned out it was a police officer, but he's on the registry for life. He can't be around his own child without guidance. Now, this person is not a threat to his own child. He's not a threat to children. The person he was interested in meeting, a woman for sex. The woman said, I'm not explaining this very well, but the point is that he went to prison. He served 3 years in prison. He deeply regrets his actions. He's off parole, yet he's on the public registry. He can't work. He can't live anywhere. He's effectively experiencing a form of social death.
So let's just generalize about this list. This list has people who have actually, well, I don't understand it, frankly.
Okay. So you can have any kind of sex offense that's requiring registration.
And the sex offense can be looking at pornography on your computer?
Right, child pornography.
Only child pornography.
Generally, yes.
So it's child pornography on your computer or talking in a chat room.
Talking in a chat room, whether
this is
somebody
all in
you
your
think is a
home
minor,
without any intention of doing anything other than doing this in your home.
Right, right. So we can talk about child pornography for a minute. Like we have extremely long sentences for child pornography. There's somebody I interview in the book who got a 100-year sentence for looking at child pornography,
and he pled to 55.
He eventually he was convicted at trial, got 100 years, and he appealed, and then it was reduced to 55. But in that case,
and he's still in. He's still
in. He's a veteran. Never had no criminal record. The state admitted that he had no intention of ever meeting a child. He'd never chatted with a child. He'd never distributed. It was simple possession. Yet his whole life is going to be spent in prison.
But that's so outrageous. I mean, does he have any access to legal assistance?
His family spent a lot of money on a defense attorney, but they're
spend
poor,
a lot of money,
and they spend a lot of money.
So can his case eventually go to the Supreme Court?
I think he's exhausted.
Cruel and unusual punishment, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, the 100 years was found to be cruel and unusual punishment, so it was reduced to 55. But there's been some research by a psychologist named Michael Sato, S-E-T-O, and some others that have found that even though we don't like to talk about this either. You can look at child pornography, and maybe you're not going to go and necessarily offend a child. And sentencing for child pornography is based on this assumption that it's like a gateway drug, that you're looking at it and you're going to eventually harm a child, or that looking at child pornography is in itself re-victimizing the person in the picture. But many people who look at child pornography, maybe they could be treated, maybe they should be punished, should they be sent away for life? It's a difficult question. John Grisham said he had a friend who had looked at some child pornography, and he suggested, well, maybe these sentences are a little bit too long. Maybe we should not have such extreme sentences. And he was attacked. People said the FBI should look at his computer, that he himself must be a child pornographer, yet he was just sort of raising a question about the length of these sentences. Nobody thinks child pornography is good. I don't condone looking at child pornography. I don't condone possessing child pornography, but I do think that maybe having some rationality in the sentences for these crimes would be a very good thing.
I find reading this book, and I read it, and so when I've been out twice since then, because I read it just before the program, all I start doing is talking about this, and people look at me, it's so against the principles we have in this country, and it's so against any idea of fairness or anything else, and it's so confusing.
Right.
Because it's so much of why does the state legislature suddenly decide? Did New York State pass it overwhelmingly in the state Senate and the House?
I'm sure it did. I don't know the votes, but I haven't really heard any politicians
ever
speaking
say anything
out
about it.
Right. Even in Missouri, there was a couple that worked very hard. Their son was convicted when he was a juvenile of touching another juvenile. And they worked really hard to try to get the state to say juveniles shouldn't be on the public registry. And they got far. They had money. They had lobbyists. They presented all the research that said juveniles are at even lower risk than adult offenders to reoffend. And yet it didn't pass.
The governor vetoed the legislation.
Yeah, the governor vetoed it because who wants to be responsible?
Every once in a while, I think there's a news item about a 7-year-old kissing a 4-year-old and they caught it calling somebody in or something like that. I mean, that is hysteria. So you can get the sense of the media when it's totally ridiculous or when they decide it's something they want to publicize the other way, right?
Right. Well, the media seizes on these stories. We love these stories. There's nothing more titillating. I mean, look at the response to Josh Duggar. I mean, that incident, whatever happened with his sisters and the babysitter happened 12 years ago.
So they lost their advertisers. The program was yanked off the air?
Yes. I think they're debating what to do with the program. But the point is the family dealt with it. They're over it. A lot of people say, well, they're against gay marriage. Well, okay, but justice, and if you believe in justice and you believe in civil liberties, you don't just defend people that have the same politics that you have.
Maybe it'll make them a little more enlightened.
Right. Well, you can only hope that if there's a silver lining, maybe this family and their supporters will say, you know what, this is not the worst thing in the world. He did wrong. He should have been punished, but the family is over it. He hasn't reoffended. He's healed. And maybe other kids in his situation, like the kids that are on the registry.
So let's summarize this. There are federal legislation, there are state laws. There are people who are sentenced to prison or to juvenile facilities and then to prison. They serve their sentences. They come out. They're on the registry. There are different levels, 1, 2, and 3, right?
That's right.
Some are on the registry for life.
Right.
Some for 30 years.
Yes.
Some for other things. There are different restrictions in different states. They send out notices in some places that somebody's living in your community. Sometimes you have to report monthly or quarterly or something to a person. If you move or travel outside of the area, you have to notify.
If you cross state lines, in many states, if you cross county lines, you have to notify law enforcement.
You can't go to places where there are children, like parks and schools and things like that.
Right, in some states you can't go to the mall.
In some cases you can't go to school with your kids unless somebody else goes with you.
Right.
And this can go on for a lifetime.
That's
for something that you paid for by serving a prison sentence.
That's right. So many states have lifetime registration.
So how do we remedy this? We do it with the states and with the federal government.
I think it has to be a bipartisan effort. It can't be a Democratic effort. It can't be a Republican effort because, as I said, when you start talking about this, the first thing people say is you're pro-child molestation, you're pro-pedophile, you don't care about victims. So it has to be a bipartisan effort. But I think it has to focus on, let's look at the reality of these crimes. Research shows most people on this registry are not a threat to children. They're not a threat to women. Let's roll this back and treat them like any other offender. I mean, at this point, that would be a good thing, even though in most areas of criminal justice, we want reform on sentencing and excessive sentencing. But in terms of sex offenders, I think post-prison sentence reform would be a good step.
And then also it's the time. I mean, we see so much now with the trans community, with same-sex marriage, with all of these different things. It's time we begin to look more into why we have this fear, this irrational fear.
Right, this irrational fear, and partly because it has to do with sex. So you're right, maybe some of this conversation that's happening around LGBTQ rights will open up a conversation about hysteria about sex.
So where should people write? What should they do? If they happen to meet a public official, start talking about it, right?
Right, and I think even just having shows like this and people being allowed to talk about these offenses without being accused of being anti-victim is the first step. And also, I think some people who have been victimized by these crimes, like I think actually Josh Duggar's sister did a good thing by saying, look, we were not happy with what he did. He violated our trust, but we've forgiven him. Being exposed to this media circus with everybody saying our brother should have been in prison forever and is a pedophile and a child molester, that's more traumatic than what happened to us. We dealt with it. He was punished. He's reformed. Why don't you let it go?
So we've come to the end of the program.
Okay.
So people should read this book.
Yes.
I mean, it is
Definitely.
shocking and you can't put it down. Or they can Google you.
Sure.
And see some of the interviews and certainly the op-ed piece. Yes. And they should start writing letters to the editor and talking to people. Thank you so much, Emily Horowitz.
Thank you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.